Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. We are here back with our summer school for product owners and managers. This is our second of the three series. It's called Back to the Feature. And today we'll talk about some inspiration and practical tips to determine the value of features. So let's get started right now. What can you expect? Well, you will learn about how to calculate cost of a feature and a nice framework for that. Then we will talk a little bit about how you can determine the feature value. And finally, we'll discuss feature bundling based on that value. My name is Jesse. I'm the co-founder of Triggre. I'm responsible for product and marketing. I have a master's in software engineering with a specialization in software architecture. This is my third company already. And my first one was at 19 when I was in university. And with my companies, I've serviced customers all the way from enterprise through to SMB. If you have a question, we have a live Q&A at the end, and we will pick up your question. You can put it in the comments. For example, here is the LinkedIn, but also on other channels that we're live on. You can put it in the comments. We'll pick it up and we'll answer it at the end of the session in our Q&A. So don't be afraid to ask a question, and I will pick it up. So let's get started with feature costs. Basically, feature costs, I like to place them in a quadrant where on the one axis, we have internal costs as well as external costs. And then on the other one, we have costs during development time, so development costs, and costs that occur during production time. So looking at the first quadrant, having development costs that are internal, we're talking about stuff that your product team does, like designing features, developing them, and testing them. Then moving on to the external costs during your development time. This is stuff like hosting. You have some licenses that you need, and perhaps there are some API fees, those type of things. And these tend to generally multiply by the number of developers that you have. Then external costs that come when you go into production are actually similar. So it's hosting, it's licenses for maybe libraries and things that you use, and API fees if you use external API fees, those things. But also this time it's multiplied, but by the users that you have usually. So some of these might scale with users. And then finally, your internal production costs. And I think this is often overlooked. So this quadrant is important. The biggest one here that I often see people not take into account, especially like if you are maybe not as knowledgeable in programming, technical debt. And this is a big one because technical debt is it builds up. We have a whole post on it on our blog that you can read. But basically, if you don't know what it is, it's the fact that if you write code today, that it sort of ages because parts around it will change, and it might make this part not fit as well. And you need to then what's called refactor it. So you have to revisit it and make sure that it stays up to date. If you ignore that, at some point things will break down and you'll have to spend a lot of time fixing it. But other things also happen, like if an external library is updated, you might have to propagate those changes into your product. You may have API changes that happen to have the same sort of thing where, if an API externally changes, maybe you have to update some things in your programming. You have to continuously do security testing to make sure that there's no vulnerabilities. And if vulnerabilities are found or they are communicated in, for example, other parts of the software that you use, then you need to issue a security update. And last but not least, of course, you need to provide support sometimes. So this is a way to think about the different cost structures of features, and these will be important for the next steps. Now, if you look at the top, basically these costs here, you can see them as your dynamic costs. They scale with developers' users. And then the ones at the bottom are also your constant costs, as in it's basically your team. So it depends on just how the size of your team, but it doesn't scale per se in terms of like, hey, if I have more users, then these costs will go up. So with the internal costs, these are usually sort of constant, at least from the user perspective, right? So if you consider it like that, they're definitely constant. So let's look at two examples of how the costs may differ per feature. We have here feature A, which is some extensive visual dashboard for our users. And we have feature B, which is a generative AI summary feature. Feature A, let's assume that about 20% of the costs are development time of the team to get it ready. And because for the visualization, we buy an external library, we have about 5% of external costs in our production time. So when we go into production, then maybe the cost for the library will increase. Maybe you have to buy a commercial license for it. So this will be a little bit higher, let's say 10%. But the bulk of the costs for this, and I speak from experience specifically in this one, will be that you have to keep updating your software with, especially a visual library. It changes often with new browsers coming out, for example. These things need a lot of attention during its lifetime. So many of the costs will actually be in the last quadrant. Then for feature B, let's assume that it's roughly the same relative development time, about 20%, but a little bit more in fees because now we need to, during testing and during development, we call an API and we need to thoroughly test it. So it might take a little bit more costs there than it will for just buying an external library, as in feature A. And then if we look at the production costs, they might be very heavily skewed towards the part where we have to pay per user, because the more users you have and the more they use this AI feature, the higher the cost that you will incur externally. And then finally, the internal costs during your production time are not that high because it's basically, if the API changes, yes, you have to update your software, but that's about it. So you can see that there's very different characteristics to two features, how the costs are divided. And I think a thing to notice is that neither one is good or bad, it's just they're different. So feature A, for example, will be very interesting if you have a lot of users, right? Because it scales well with the number of users. It doesn't cost you a lot per user to add them. Now, feature B is very interesting for small amounts of users, but may quickly get out of hand if you have tons of users that use it all the time, because your external dynamic costs are pretty steep. So that's a thing to take into account. And so these features, they have different cost structures, and it's a good thing to understand these before you develop them. You don't have to get it like all the way correct, like at the last euro or dollar, but you want to have an idea where is the main part of your costs situated. And that brings us to feature value. So feature value is something that I like to split up into two parts. On the one hand, we have the internal value, basically the value that we, as the person or company that develops it, derive from a feature. And on the other one, there's the external value, which is the value that our customer will derive from a feature. So just to give you an idea, internal value can be things like lowering those constant costs, lowering those dynamic costs. Also, for example, fewer support hours needed. You can think about the automation of internal processes, longer customer lifetime. Now, you might think this is external, but this is actually, if customers just hang on longer, this is actually for us a very interesting one, without actually for them the price changing. An increase in market share, for example, can be where a new feature might open an option to increase your market share. and similar things that sort of have an impact on your business. Now, the external value, on the other hand, is the value as perceived by the customer. So basically, workload lowered, hours saved is a very common one, but also the ability to enter a new market. Sometimes having a product or a specific feature will allow them to enter a new market, introduce a new product, maybe increase their margins on current sales, lower production costs, etc. So all these things that sort of they would use to identify whether it's worth paying for a feature. So what do they save? What do they gain? Now, another way to think about this is that you can say that the external value for your customer is the perceived value. So for them, they perceive that your feature or your product gives them a certain value. So this is what we'll call this from now on. This is an important concept to remember. So let's take a look at how this perceived value part works. Now, first, we're going to plot costs and value. And this is going to be just one vertical axis. It starts at 0 and basically, theoretically at least, goes on until infinity. You can think about this as a quantity like a currency. Whichever currency you feel fluent in is fine. We're talking relative terms today only. So whether you think in dollars or in euros or in some other currency, that doesn't really matter. And let's say that right now the total cost of our feature, for example, over the course of a year, so including both the constant and the dynamic cost, is roughly here, right? Okay. So then the goal is to make sure that we create internal value over the same period of time. So let's take a year that is larger than our total costs, and preferably by a pretty big margin, right? So the costs that we incur should be lower, of course, than the internal value. And this is basically our internal business case, these things. So if we derive a lot of value from this, maybe hours saved, automated processes, etc., then we have an internal business case. Keep that in mind. Okay, so let's take a look at then how that perceived value works. So ideally, the value that your customers perceive, again, over the same period as your cost calculation, very important, is many times higher than those costs. Right? This would be your ideal thing. So you create a lot of perceived value for a low cost. That's what you want to do. Note that you will have to divide the cost by the number of users here, or the number of customers for your product or feature, because the perceived cost is also per user or per customer, right? So you have to take that into account. So what I've now done is, with this difference, you sort of see that the difference between the perceived value and the cost is what we call pricing power. And this is an extremely important concept for feature value, because this is basically, you can put your price anywhere between these two lines to make a profit. And you might be tempted to say like, oh, you know what, I'll put it right up there near the perceived value because my customer is willing to pay that, right? If it's so high, so much difference, I'll put it up there. Good. I would argue that it's better to put it a little bit lower, like somewhere here, because what you need to remember is that your customer also has a business case. And for them, that business case looks like this. Their cost is your price. And so their perceived value versus your costs needs to be a very good business case still. So you need to take that into account. And we'll get to this specific size of this business case later when we talk about features and how to use them in bundles. So take that into account, that the difference between the perceived value by the customer and the price that they pay is your customer business case, but the perceived value versus the cost is your pricing power. Okay, so back to our internal business case, right? So we have the internal value with our internal business case. Okay. So this is our internal one. And now that we have set a price, we also have another part of feature value, and that is the external business case, right? So the difference between the price that we ask and the cost that we incur is our external business case. So this is the money that we make off of our customers, and the internal one is the money that we make, that we save, that we internally. Now, this is the margin basically on your feature, but don't mistake it for another common metric, COGS, which is cost of goods sold, because that doesn't take into account the development costs, which we explicitly do take into account here. COGS usually only involves the running costs of servers and stuff. So this is really, this is a different cost level, just in case that you were wondering. So you have now the internal and the external business case. Now, from here, we're interested in the business case only. So with both the internal and external parts of the business case clear, we can add these up. And this gives us the total business case as calculated from the cost level. And this part, now that we know that, that is the total value that our feature brings us. So now that we know that, this is basically our business case, right? This is the total value that it will bring us. And that means that this is a little bit tricky, but I've eliminated both the costs for both business cases here, but this is indeed how it works. So you have your costs, and then on top of that, your internal and external business case. That gives you the total value of your feature. And if we now take into account this business case and we view our costs as our investment, right? So we have a feature, we obviously we incur costs, and we see that as an investment. What we can now do is very easily calculate the return on investment, which is very important if you want to think about features and say like, hey, this is what I want to make on it. And it's a very good way to compare features. So what you do is you take the cost and the total value, you divide them and you multiply them by 100% to get your ROI. This works because total value is revenue that you get minus cost, which was already in our calculation by adding up the business cases and the cost, and then you divide it by the cost. So this is a way to calculate the ROI of your feature. And even if you do it sort of relatively, maybe not entirely in euros, but like you can say like, oh, this is a larger total value, we can add more. It gives you an idea of how to calculate ROI based on features. And then you can say like, hey, maybe we want to have the one with the highest ROI the fastest, but it also depends obviously on stuff like development time and everything. At least this gives you an idea of what value features will bring versus the cost that you invest in them. And then that brings us finally to feature bundling, because we can now use this value and the cost analysis to sort of handle our feature bundling in a smarter way. To understand how to use this, let's discuss for a bit the leader killer framework. If you've never heard of it, it's a way to identify features, and I think it's very important to understand that. And here's how. So basically, first you need to understand these three. So here we go. Leader features. Leader features are your product's most valuable and unique features, I would say. These features differentiate your product from competitors. They're the primary reasons why users choose your product over alternatives. Leader features are basically essential to your product success, right? So an example for Triggre is we have an error tracing feature. It's a visual way to trace a problem that you need to solve in your design instead of textual error messages. And no other platform has this feature. And it's a great way to make designing applications easier for users. And that's one of our USPs, that we want to make things very easy. So this is why for us that is a leader feature. Then we have filler features. Now, filler features are the product's additional features that provide value, but are not essential to the product's success. These features can be used to round out the product's offerings and add additional value to the user or the customer. For Triggre, for example, a killer feature would be our custom web API feature. So customers are willing to pay for it because it provides value, but they're also kind of expecting a platform like Triggre to be able to connect to any API they come across. So it's kind of like, yeah, okay, it has value, but it's not super unique in the way that maybe the tracing of errors is. And then finally, we have the killer feature, and not the killer as in like, oh, that's killer. No, the killer as in it's a killer. It's bad. So killer features are those features that users don't value and they're not willing to pay for having a feature that sort of falls into this category for them. So these features can diminish the value of the entire product bundle, as your customers will feel like they are paying for things that they don't want. At Triggre, for example, we have deliberately chosen not to charge for storage capacity because our customers value simplicity, as I said before. So instead of making it hard on them and having a feature where we go like, oh, you have to buy like this much storage in this tier and you get this much storage in that tier, we simply use a fair use policy. That way, we avoid having to charge for something that people feel that should be part of our product anyway, and sort of avoids us having that as sort of a killer or sort of like a stopper where you're like, oh, this is annoying. I don't want to pay specifically for like an extra gigabyte of storage. So that's how we solve it. And I think one interesting thing is that we'll get to that later again. But what is a killer for someone in one tier might be a leader in another tier. So that's an interesting one to keep in mind. But then how do you identify these leaders, fillers, and killers? So let's start with the leaders. We can use the value framework that we just talked about right before. So it goes from 0 to infinity if you're very lucky. And so for leaders, basically what happens is that the perceived value should be far outweighing the price, right? And that's what we said before. That's sort of the external business case. And for leader features, this should be how it is because there's a large willingness to pay. This is what you create by putting your price a little bit lower, maybe than you could, is creating a large willingness to pay. And so you can also create leaders like this. Given that the perceived value is high enough versus your cost, you can put your price relative to your cost high, but keep it very low compared to the perceived value. That's how you identify a leader feature. Now, for fillers, the perceived value is much lower, and as a result, so is the willingness to pay. So it's still there. There's still a willingness to pay, but the perceived value is far closer to your cost level, meaning that you don't have as much pricing power on these features, right? Remember that concept of pricing power. So perhaps you have a smaller willingness to pay. So these are often features that are still worth pointing out, for example, as they do represent some value. But let's say if you omit them, right, the perceived value of your product would be lower. There's still some value in them. Just make sure to identify which are the fillers and include them in your tiers specifically, right? So they do add value, but they're not the ones that make people buy your product. They're almost sort of hygienic. People expect them to be there. They're willing to pay a little bit, but not too much. And then the killers. Here, the perceived value is lower than the price that the customer is willing to pay. So you should leave these out, like we discussed. For us, that would be storage specifically. People don't like that in our case, so we leave it out. And now you may wonder, like, why would you have killer features at all, right? I mean, if they're killer, why wouldn't you just scratch them? Shouldn't these be non-existent? But for that, we need to look at how you bundle these features. So let's go to the next step here. And let's say that we have 3 tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, like pretty basic ones. Let's assume that we have a individual, team, and enterprise, right? These are pretty common structures that you see in pricing tiers. So what you want to do is identify the leaders, fillers, and killers for each tier. And this is very important. So features can be a leader for one tier, but a killer for another tier. For example, single sign-on might be a leader for your enterprise tier 3 on the right, but it might be a killer for your tier 1 because no individual wants to pay for single sign-on features, right? So think about that. So it really depends on your segmentation, whether it's a killer or a filler or a leader. This is super important. So when you distribute your features over your tiers, you need to have a few leader features in each of the tiers. So let's say that we have a distribution, something like this. There should also be fillers as long as you are certain there are no killers in there. So for example, that single sign-on feature would only appear in probably, well, maybe in team, but probably in enterprise level, right? So that's where you put the SSO feature, and then it's a leader. But if I would put it in tier 2, it might be a filler, and if I put it in tier 1, it might be a killer feature. And that's not what we want. So it really is important to think deeply about, the pricing power that you have, and then the place where you put your feature based on that. So what you basically see in this structure is that from the left to the right, you have a higher willingness to pay for certain features um, than than for others, and that's the thing that you need to take into account, right? So the enterprise tier is usually it's more packed, so that's what you see. So usually your enterprise customers will be more willing to pay for things. This is why usually those are the more filled packages, because most features that are a leader for an individual are also at least a filler for your enterprise often. But the other way around often is not the case. So often what is a leader feature for enterprise is a killer feature for your individual. Because of the scale at which these people work, they can be very different. So remember that. So usually for the individuals, like level, that the leaders are sort of the key things in your product offering. But then as you move to enterprise, there will be sort of features that are sort of more around the core of your product that specifically cater to them and suddenly make them a leader feature. That's a very important aspect to take into account. And I hope that this gives you a complete overview of how you can determine costs for your feature, like we started off with. Then, with the cost structure, determine the pricing power that you have and the business case for the feature. From that, calculate your ROI, place them into your different tiers, and as such, have a very thorough understanding of how to prioritize which features you should develop, for whom they are intended, and why they are intended for that tier or segment. That concludes our presentation, our summer school for today. We're going into some questions that we have gotten right now. Feel free to still ask questions if you have them. You can drop them in the comments. This is the itinerary. This is number 2 today, July 23rd. The next one, we'll talk about feature life cycles on August 27. Basically, when to decide to build a feature, but also extremely important, when to decide to retire your feature and how to go about it. We have a mailing list if you want to keep up to date about our summer schools and future information for you as a product manager and product owner. You can sign up here by scanning the link or trig.re/summer school. So that's Triggre/summer school. And I have a couple of questions that I will go through now. Let me see here. Let's see this one. So Annika asks, how do you handle feature requests that are valuable but only serve a small segment of users? Let's assume that it's not a segment that we talked about before. So not I'm assuming it's like not your individuals or anything, but let's say a specific target audience. What you can do is, it's an interesting question. What you can do is, if this happens, you can make that feature probably an add-on, right? Because let's say that most of your users would find it a killer, and then for a couple of people, it will be a leader, right? That's basically the thing. What you can then do is say, like, hey, you can buy this add-on for your thing. You see this often with let's say with integrations, right? Platform has like 1,000 integrations. Okay, fantastic. But I only want to use the ones that I actually have. Like I have Salesforce, I have Pipedrive, I have HubSpot, whatever CRM system. I don't want to pay for all three of them. I want to pay only for the one that I use. That's a way that you can say like, hey, that's an add-on, and then if you activate the add-on, you pay, I don't know, a couple bucks a month extra. So that's a way that you can handle it. Interesting question. Thank you for asking that. Let's say here, Lena asks, does it make sense to share your roadmap publicly? Yeah, it depends a little bit, I think, on the type of product. So in our case, we tend to share our roadmap pretty broad stroked. But you also see, for example, other companies who may have like voting systems for features. They might sort of have like the sort of the, the sort of the Stack Overflow type like voting systems where you can like upvote stuff. So that is also something that you see. It really depends on your product. What I would usually suggest if I would start any new product, like not Triggre, but just anything separately, I would try to make a group of people that is sort of close and trusted. Maybe your top users, or maybe if you have a partner structure, distributor structure, something like that. If you want to work with that, get those people involved and talk to them about your roadmap, because with them, I think you can identify what the next steps are. I think a very important thing to always do is to communicate when you have new features out, or when any changes are made. Then that's definitely something that you want to communicate to your users, of course. So it really depends on that, and then there's the aspect of whether you want to have your competitors see your roadmap. So there's that question as well that you have to ask yourself, and it depends on the product, of course. We have one more question I see. Carlos asks, like, how do you assess the demand for a feature before investing in development? So that is a good question. We haven't really touched on this specifically, but I think that there's a couple of ways, and it depends on how your organization works. So I think there's a couple of interesting ways that you can do this. One really interesting way, I think, is let's say that you don't have access to like a vast sales network, or you don't want to send out a questionnaire or something. Then some of the tips that I've gotten is you can build sort of access to the feature in your product. So let's say that you have a page with we're talking about integrations, right? Let's say that you have a page with integrations. You click the integration, and then when you click it, it says we're developing. We're currently we are working on this feature. It is coming soon. And then what you can do, obviously, you don't want to do that with too many things, but what you can then do is order your sort of demand by the number of clicks that were given onto that feature in your product, so you know what users are sort of looking for in your product. That's one of the smartest ways. It's a tough one a little bit, and it depends on having many users. But that's a really interesting one. Another one, obviously, the sort of more straightforward ones would be sending out a questionnaire. But you have to really be careful with the wording in the questionnaire, because it's very easy to lead people in questionnaires, and then yeah, it's tough to then really get the right answer. So that's a whole science in itself. So those are a couple of ways that you can do it. And the third one, which I like, is asking your sales or distributor network periodically, like, hey, look, we have these features. You give a bit of a presentation on them, and then ask people to give to order them in their view, which one should be like the highest priority versus the lowest priority. And you ask these people, they can, even if they're there in a session, like maybe a live stream, sort of webinar version, or physical version, you gather that data from them. These are your trusted people that then identify which things you need. All in all, basically, you need to listen to your audience, and hear or find out what they really want. So not what they say they need, but sort of what they say they need, and then sort of understanding the problem, building a feature for that, and then assessing the demand for that feature. I think that's very important. I think that is it for the questions. Thank you so much for attending our second summer school. The third one is, as you can see, is on August 27, also at 11 CEST, where we'll talk about the feature lifecycle. So we've talked in the past, on the first session, we talked about feature simplicity, how to design features that are easy to use and are fun to use for your users. Ways to do that. You can check that out still by going back to our LinkedIn page. There's the recording is still there. Today was feature evaluation. You can rewatch this as well later on. And then on August 27th, we have feature lifecycle. Thank you so much. And I hope to see you next time at the Triggre Summer School. Bye-bye.